Hi, welcome to lesson 4 of our Safe Sanctuary Policy for Church of the Master, United Methodist. My name is Bev Pankos, and I'm the Director of Youth Ministries and the staff member who oversees the Safe Sanctuary Policy for the church. And this lesson is on our older and vulnerable adults specific pieces that we need to keep in mind. So let's get started. First of all, you need to know that the older and vulnerable adult piece of our Safe Sanctuary Policy is pretty new. And we are always looking for ways to refine it and make sure we're doing the best we can for our older and vulnerable adults. A couple of things that we want to keep in mind. We want the same gender rule here at Church of the Master. So caregivers in pastoral care ministries will always be assigned care receivers who are the same gender. Workers who serve in pastoral care areas will keep records of all visits in case a question arises. We are lucky at Church of the Master to have an active Stephen ministry team, and they have the rule of same gender for their caregivers to their care receivers. And so our Safe Sanctuary Policy follows that. We agree that that is a good rule to have. Make sure that we're not putting any of our volunteer caregivers in an awkward position, or our care receivers as well. Some things to look for if you're working with our older and vulnerable adults would be signs of abuse or neglect, which vary some from what you have seen in previous lessons in our Safe Sanctuary Policy. And so here's a couple things you need to keep in mind if you are working with our older and or vulnerable adults. Abuse and neglect of older people includes several categories of acts and or omissions, generally referred to as abuse, neglect, exploitation, and abandonment. Signs of potential abuse or neglect include an elderly person with bruises, welts, or burns, or evidence of physical restraints, an elderly person who appears over or under medicated, an elderly person with inadequate food or water or with unclean clothes or bedding, an elderly person whose caregiver abuses alcohol or who is emotionally unstable, an elderly person who previously had excellent credit or resources but now seems to unable to meet expenses, an elderly person whose caregiver is under severe stress such as illness, unemployment, or family problems, an elderly person living in a family with history of violence such as child or spouse abuse, and an elderly person who has not permitted visitors or direct private communications with others. All of these examples would raise red flags for us if we're working with our older and vulnerable adults at Church of the Master. And any questions you had about something connected to one of these would be best suited to talk to our pastor or the head of our congregational care team, and they would be able to help you know a little bit more about the person that you are working with to know whether you're seeing this type of neglect or abuse. And I should say that anything that you share in confidence anything you share with the pastor or with a member of the program staff or with our congregational care team leader or Stephen minister. When it comes to ministry, confidentiality can be still kept. It is not going against confidentiality to share a concern with one of those folks that I mentioned about someone who is in our older or vulnerable adult population. If you remember, in one of our previous lessons, I talked about touch and appropriate or inappropriate touch when it came to our children and youth. And I said at that point that we would talk more about it when we got to our older and vulnerable adult lesson. And so here we are. Touching is a whole different ballgame when you're talking to about older or vulnerable adults. In particular, they usually lack the physical touch that was once so vital to their beings. And as we age, people feel uncomfortable touching older and vulnerable adults, and we tend not to touch at all. Holding a hand, resting a hand lightly on the back or shoulder would be appropriate for these adults. Touching behavior should be not given even in the appearance of wrongdoing. As ministry workers, our behavior must foster trust at all times. It should be above reproach. Any person's preference to not be touched should be respected. Do not force affection upon a reluctant person. Church workers are responsible for protecting our children, our youth, and our older and vulnerable adults under their supervision from inappropriate touching by others. But here's something we need to remember. I have many times in my time at Church of the Master, when I have been greeting at the end of the service, there are older folks who want a hug. Now, we are in time of COVID-19, so that whole piece will be different for a while. But you know what? One time I was at the door and I was, wishing people a good day. And one of the ladies asked me if she could have a hug. And she said, "This is the only hug I'm going to get all week." And I thought for a moment as I was giving her the hug, is there a way I could swing by her house a couple times during the week and give her a hug? I am a person who loves hugs. And so I get them all the time from my mom, from my husband, from my son. We're huggy people. And there are older and vulnerable adults who are like that too. And as people age and their families move away or their spouse has passed away, then they're even more, they have a bigger desire to have that touch. And so we have to balance touch when it comes to our older and vulnerable adults about what is going to be good for them versus what we get in return. For me and the church member who commented that she needed a hug, I just made sure when I was at the door, if she was there, I'd say, "Can I have a hug?" And if she's like, "Of course you can." Or I would say, "Do you need a hug?" And she's like, "Of course I do." And so you have to just balance that out. Keeping in mind those things we mentioned, that how do we do it? Is it appropriate? Giving a hug. It's a hug in the midst of a lot of people. It's okay. Or that picking up a hand and just giving them a little squeeze on their hand or your hand on their shoulder. Whatever is comfort for you in giving that touch that our older and vulnerable adults need versus what we feel like we need ourselves. And so those are just a couple things about touching when it comes to our older and vulnerable adults. And that we as volunteers, as staff members who work with that population need to keep that in mind as we serve God, working with our friends who are older and our friends who are more vulnerable. This is the end of our lesson on older and vulnerable adults. Thank you for watching this video. Please take a moment and click on the Google form link below in the comments to take a short quiz so we know that you have trained on this piece of our Safe Sanctuary policy. Thank you so much for wanting to volunteer with our older and vulnerable adults. We have some amazing folks who really could use some care from our congregation, and so we appreciate all of you who feel called to work with our older and vulnerable adults. Have a great day.